right, hello everybody, and welcome to, I think, the third of our Friday afternoon virtual histories. This is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're pleased to be back with our partner, the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. Before I introduce today's speaker, as a total aside, if you have ever wondered what the basement laundry room of an 1860s Bolton Hill row house looks like, that was modeled in the 1970s, just look behind me, because that's where I am today. It is blessedly quiet though. Thank you for everybody who has donated as part of today's talk. Your support really helps both Baltimore Heritage and the Architecture Foundation. And then final thing before introducing today's speaker is next week, a week from today, same time, 1 o'clock, we're going to be pleased to have architecture professor Dale Green from Morgan State talk about early African-American architects in Baltimore. So if you can, join us for that. All right, today's speaker, Julian Frost, is going to talk about Lake Clifton High School. Julian graduated from Baltimore City College, incidentally, where my daughter is currently a sophomore. She is a virtual sophomore. I think Julian graduated in time that he got to do that in person. And he is currently at Haverford University, but still has roots in Baltimore and roots and interest in historic Baltimore. So I'm going to say thank you to Julian. Oh, I know one more thing. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we're going to get to them at the end of Julian's talk. And with that, Julian, I am going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Johns. Thank you, Nathan, and everyone else who allowed me to do this and set this up. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, there we go. So my name is Julian Frost. I'm a sophomore at Haverford College, currently in Baltimore. And today I'll be presenting on Lake Clifton High School. You might be wondering why I, a 19-year-old college student, is doing this talk when all of the previous talks have been done by, like, professionals in their field or like academics and that kind of thing. And my answer would be that I was not anticipating doing this kind of talk. I was writing a paper about this school for one of my classes, and I reached out to Jillian Storms, who kindly gave me some primary source documents of the school. And I think when she read my paper, she asked me to do this. So it's an unexpected opportunity, but I'm happy to be doing it. All right, I guess I'll begin. So first, I just want to ask if anyone who has ever been a part of any school community that's ever occupied the Lake Clifton campus, could you please just put something in the chat and just indicate that? Because when I get to the end of my presentation, I would love to be able to hear from people that were actually there, because I'm going to be interpreting the building, but that's only based on my limited experience of being around the building and also of my research. And so I would love to get a little bit of kind of personal experience from people that actually spent a significant amount of time there, because the narrative might not be completely complete without that. So I'm going to start off with an intro, as I'm doing right now. Then I'll give some general history, just some context that kind of feeds into the story of the school. Then I'm going to give a bit of an early history of Lake Clifton High School based on kind of primary source documents. I'm a lot more interested in the early history because I think that's really focused on the optimism of the early years. And I feel like it's not as much of my place to kind of speculate on the later years as much. And I think, talking about the early years is where I can kind of contribute. And I don't want to talk over other people's experiences in the later years. And after that, I'll kind of go into a bit of analysis based on some inference on my part about how Lake Clifton's design and program was shaped by its historical context. So I'll continue. So my motivation for doing this in general is that I have spent a fair amount of time around the school because I worked at Real Food Farm the summer before college. And so I spent a lot of time just like around the campus. And I always just kind of saw it as like your run-of-the-mill public high school. Like I didn't think the architecture was particularly beautiful in any way. I thought like maybe it's bigger than normal, like I don't know. But I just never really realized the extent to which its history kind of reflects uh, a very tumultuous time in Baltimore's history, which is what I would call the urban crisis, which is a time from, it's kind of ill-defined from like the 60s and from the 60s to the 70s. And it's when all sorts of urban issues like deindustrialization, structural racism, white flight, and all of that stuff kind of accumulated and caused a time of urban crisis and great tension. And so I will be talking about how that context shapes the school. So Lake Clifton High School is located in Northeast Baltimore, right there, just north of North Avenue, east of the little cluster with Eastern and City, and just south of Lake Montebello. So you can see it here. The reason it's called Lake Clifton High School is because it was built on what was formerly a city reservoir called Lake Clifton. Here it is a few years before it was built. And here it is just a year after it was built in 1971. And you can see it just like took the place of the water basically. Just to situate you in space, just in a very basic sense, here are kind of like the basic elements of this kind of strange and sprawling campus. So there's an octagonal auditorium, and a central hub with kind of administrative offices and cafeterias and that kind of thing. And then the classrooms are situated in these strange like axial buildings called the A and B units, and those are linked to the central hub by a kind of like aerial walkway, you can see. And then finally, there's a huge complex with 2 full gymnasiums and a swimming pool and a bunch of locker rooms. So I think a good way to kind of start off by talking about, to start off with the more thematic elements of this school is by referring to the work of an architectural historian named Amber Wiley. She wrote her dissertation about 3 urban public high schools that were built under very similar circumstances as Lake Clifton. And I think this little excerpt from the abstract will be helpful in kind of defining and kind of just listing off some basic characteristics of the school and why they're important. So she writes, this dissertation documents and contextualizes the creation of fortified yet programmatically innovative high schools designed between 1960 and 1980 in Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. The striking nature of the school designs, avant-garde in materiality, scale, programming, and plan, are testaments to the high ideals of education reform for urban cities that were battling the damaging effects of suburbanization, urban unrest, and riots. So pretty much everything that I've bolded here applies to the school, and I just think it's a good way of kind of encapsulating some essential characteristics of the school. So the way I would kind of distill this down for my purposes, with taking a lot of inspiration from Amber Wiley, I must say, I would say that the school is quite defined by its context of being built in 1971 during the urban crisis. And this kind of comes in 2 forms. First, the urban crisis resulted in a lot of social and racial tension, including the 1968 riots, which resulted in a sense of fortification in the school's design. And I'll argue more about that later. Also, the urban crisis and all of the issues that made up the urban crisis kind of launched this era of education reform, in which a lot of emphasis and money and innovation was put into public education in the hopes that it could be kind of an answer for a lot of the urban problems at the time. All right, so these ideals of education reform can be seen in the optimism present in the school's design and its kind of curriculum and program. And I think this is one of the most interesting things about Lake Clifton is that even though it looks like a kind of run-of-the-mill high school, if you look into the history of it, there were really quite grand expectations for it during its early years. Okay, so now we'll just briefly go over some relevant historical events and trends that kind of feed into the school's story. So first of all, of course, Baltimore has a history of engineered structural racism. Whether this was kind of cruelly innovative, like housing ordinances, like the one profiled here, in which said that no Black person could move onto a block that was 50% white or more, and vice versa. And then later on, things like redlining and predatory real estate practices. Also, in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision went through, which outlawed segregation in schools. And in Baltimore, the school board opted for a free choice policy, which meant that just given the racial tensions of the time, despite the fact that segregation was outlawed in schools, there was no real effort to integrate. So this kind of just resulted in segregation continuing for the most part, despite a little bit of integration here and there. Also, I already mentioned the urban crisis, and I would say one of the defining moments of the urban crisis is the riots across the country. And in Baltimore, this was the riots in 1968, which happened right after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And just to illustrate the proximity, both in terms of time and space, of the riots to the story of Lake Clifton, here's a plot of incidents that took place during the 1968 riots, whether that was lootings or acts of violence or arson. So the site, here I'll zoom in, and you can see there are plenty of incidents kind of just around the neighborhood, especially closer to downtown, close to the future location of Lake Clifton High School. And also even if, so also like for the architects, I think even if the architects didn't live around here, I think a psychology of fear kind of arose as a result of the riots, which means that just the overall tension of the riots definitely influenced the school's design in some way, which I will talk about later. Also, just anecdotally, the National Guard had their main camp in Lake Clifton during the riots. It was like where they put their supplies and camped out in that like emergency situation during April of 1968. Also, finally, just in general, and going on in the background of all of this, there's this huge baby boomer generation, which is putting a strain on the very old and aging school system of Baltimore, which is getting really overburdened. So this would require solutions. So now I'm going to transfer or go on to the more historical narrative of the school itself. So in the late 60s, to address this issue of school overcrowding that the baby boomers inadvertently created, wasn't their fault, there's this huge school construction initiative that was planned. And it was by far the most ambitious school construction program that Baltimore has ever attempted. And one of these schools that would be built was Lake Clifton High School. It was one of 3 high schools that would be built, and it was by far the most expensive. So I would say, in a way, it's kind of the crown jewel of this whole project. And so there were high hopes for it. So in the late 60s, Lake Clifton was drained, as you can see. And the architects were chosen. So it was Smealy, the architecture firm of Smealy, Orrick, and Yanka was selected. They're like a local Baltimore firm that is located on York Road. Just as an aside, their work has made a bit of a mark on Baltimore in various ways. And I think you might notice some kind of similar motifs of Lake Clifton to these buildings. So they helped out with designing the Keswick Multi-Care Center, as well as Govin's Manor on York Road. And most interestingly, in my opinion, they apparently helped out with designing the Central Booking Center in downtown Baltimore. And that's interesting to think about once we get to the part about fortification. So construction began, and it's important to remember that at this time, every single school in Baltimore that had previously existed had some sort of racial association with it. Like for instance, like Frederick Douglass High School was always a Black school, and a place like Northern was always white. So here was a new school on fairly neutral territory that was supposed to be an agent of racial desegregation in schools. So they thought if we build this grand, technologically advanced high school, everyone will want to come, white kids, Black kids, everyone. So during the summer before for the first school year in 1971, the school board tries to make up this new racially integrated student body for Lake Clifton. So they take the 10th grade of the all-white Northern High School and order them to go to Lake Clifton for the next school year. And for whatever reason, whether it was racism or just convenience, the parents were not happy about this at all and banded together to reverse the school board's decision. So the school board relented and allowed the kids from Northern to just have free choice with where they wanted to go. So on the first day of school, the school was basically all Black because the kids from Northern just didn't show up. So the school got a bit of a tough, they got some bad press within the first month when there's this quote, bottle throwing melee at the school. And whether or not this account was exaggerated or not by the newspaper, it still fed into the fears of white parents and made it really difficult for the school to attract back white kids, which was a main part of their mission. They were trying to help desegregate schools. So this is just, it gives the school a bad rap from the beginning. So in response to this, they bring in a new principal named Boyce Mosley to kind of sell back the school to white parents. And he's very explicit about this. He directly says that he's trying to relieve the fears of the white parents. So he plans out this desegregation plan, which will send away about half of the existing mostly Black student body and bring in white kids from other schools to make the school 40% white for the next school year in 1975. And to do this, he does this big public relations campaign where he does open houses, tours. He hires more white secretaries to make kids more comfortable, because I guess a white kid would be more comfortable seeing someone of their own race. That was what he said. And also he establishes community rooms for white parents, and I guess parents overall, to just come in and see what's happening. And just to underline how important he thought this desegregation plan was to the future of the school, he says, if we succeed at desegregating Lake Clifton, we will succeed in the system. If it fails here, we will fail in the system. So he puts the plan in place for the 1975 school year, and almost immediately white kids start transferring away under suspect circumstances, and he tries to stop them, but very quickly, white students just start moving away, and before too long, Lake Clifton flips back to almost completely Black. And just going back to his quote, I read it as almost a prediction that the future of Lake Clifton as an institution hinges on the success of this desegregation plan. And it seems that since the desegregation plan was only briefly instituted and then failed, it seems that he was kind of right, because after all, the school is now abandoned and did not carry on as like a perpetual institution, unfortunately. So here's just a brief outline of the later history of the school. So in 1986, Eastern High School, the all-girls school, merges with Lake Clifton. And in 2005, that school closes due to low enrollment. And for the next decade, the campus is used by various high schools that kind of take up little bits of the huge complex. And in 2020, Baltimore City announces plans to sell the building, most likely to Morgan State, who will have no other choice than to demolish it because it has some serious structural issues and is apparently sinking into its foundation. So now I'm going to kind of hop off of that historical narrative, because I think I've gotten as far as I want to go in terms of that. And now flip back to the more kind of thematic points, going back to this kind of little framework that I took from Amber Wiley. So I'm going to start with how this kind of era of education reform can be seen in a sense of optimism in the school's design, and that was really most significant in its early years. So first of all, most specifically to this idea of education reform, so a lot of like academics and like researchers had all these kind of new academic philosophies that they had like, you know, written down on paper that they like planned out using lots of research. And one of these was that called the House Plan. It was popularized in New England, and it was used to handle a large student population, but to give students the maximum amount of like individual care. And they did this by having lots of mini schools under kind of one roof, figuratively. And this can be seen within the actual like physical shape of the school, because like a city, a school like City is like basically all under one roof. You know, it's just one building. But Lake Clifton, it kind of like personifies this philosophy because it has lots of different kind of branches and different areas for different kind of sections to thrive. Like for instance, there was like a vocational focus as well as an academic focus, which would have been in separate areas. Also, at this time, in 1971, the city instituted its magnet plan, in which they made, I think, 7 high schools in the area, magnet schools, to just kind of maximize resources and, you know, potential for students. And specifically to Lake Clifton, they made Lake Clifton focused on foreign relations and foreign languages, and also on the construction trades and vocational trades. So through these two kind of huge plans, you can see that Lake Clifton was kind of on the forefront of the educational reform of the time. Another thing is that it seems that the architects and the people who kind of designed the building set out to create an atmosphere of cultural enrichment for the students. And I highly recommend learning more about this by looking at the lecture by Ryan Patterson about the many artworks that are in here. Yeah, like, so as the budget of the school ballooned, so did the amount of money that was allocated for art. So they're able to purchase some quite expensive pieces by like really famous artists. I won't go into detail, but I highly recommend watching Ryan's lecture. And here is a picture of the architects probably posing, it's probably a pose picture, with one of the artists, Betty Wells, who had a piece in the school. And this just shows that the architects likely had, they wanted the space to be, you know, a place of cultural enrichment and inspiration for kids, even though now the school might seem a little bit kind of not great or kind of almost oppressive. It's just, I think it's useful to look back at what the architects and designers like intended for the building. I think that's important. Another thing is to look at the kind of architectural merit of the design of the school itself. So for one, the school is very like horizontally oriented and sprawling. And this is kind of accented by these kind of bands, these concrete white bands that kind of almost make up these like planes that kind of intersect or run parallel to one another. And I think this is a motif that comes up a lot in modernist architecture. So I wouldn't be surprised if the architects, you know, took inspiration from other modernist buildings. Also, the campus reminds me of the Bauhaus campus in Dessau, Germany, because of this might seem like an audacious comparison, but it just reminded me, the similarity I see is that there's a complete lack of symmetry, and also that there's no one place you can stand to have a central view. Like, for instance, if you're standing in front of city, like that's exactly what you're supposed to see. Like that's the main facade. But here it's kind of just unclear, what's the front and all of that. There's no real centrality to it. Just to bring this comparison further, I see a similarity in the way that they kind of cast the base of the building in shadow to kind of minimize the amount of like mass, and to kind of create a bit of a floating effect in the building, and just to kind of make it a bit more elegant and less imposing, perhaps. Also, one of the most kind of distinctive motifs you can see in the building, especially kind of if you're on the ground around the building, is these concrete Y structures that seem to be mostly ornamental, as well as serving as awnings. And you can see them at the top of the kind of stairwells and at the top of every entrance. And I think these kind of balance out the sense of horizontality of the school and give it a little bit of loftiness. Also, I think just the shape itself kind of reminds me just of a bird or a plane, and it just kind of reminds me of, it makes sense that architects wanting to create a very progressive design would make this kind of flying, lofty shape as a primary motif of the building. So I hope that evidence kind of shows some of the ways that, despite the fact that this school might seem a little bit dilapidated now, there was real thought and money and effort put into making it like a nurturing environment. And it was really like, there are really high expectations for it in the beginning, even if they aren't very clear right now. So now I'll focus on the flip side of it, which is how social and racial tension resulted in, I would argue, a sense of fortification in the school's design and placement. So these are the two other schools, the two other high schools that were built under this, the huge school construction plan that I mentioned. One is Southwestern High School and the other is Walbrook High School. And honestly, I would say that these schools are a little bit more obviously fortified because they're less spread out and taller, which means that like they're kind of more fortress-like and they have more of a facade that can be really imposing. And they kind of they resemble like brutalism a little bit more than Lake Clifton would, I think. I was actually reading a newspaper article from 1971 about kind of the opening of Southwestern High School. And like, there's a quote from a police officer. Like a police officer said to a teacher, like, how does it feel to teach in a prison? Which, I mean, I guess it kind of looks like a prison. Anyway, back to Lake Clifton. It looks like they tried to minimize the amount of glass that could be broken, just in terms of like, as a kind of practical consideration. For instance, like most of the windows are pretty high up, and the windows that are there either have these kind of literal bars over them or are kind of segmented in a way that looks a little bit like bars in some way. Also, I'm not sure if you can see, but kind of up on top of the building, there are these, maybe it's covering like a generator or something, but it looks a little bit like the top of a castle or like a rampart or something. Let's see. Also, so in this article by Daniel Berger from 1986, he talks about a teacher that told him in an interview that she found the architecture oppressive. And I think this is an interesting idea to look into, because even though at the time the architects probably weren't trying to make this oppressive, I just think it's interesting to look into. So I did find some similarities between the axial structure of the two classroom buildings and the Curran-Fromhold Correctional Facility in Philadelphia. As you can see, both in terms of the spread out format and the axial structure, which would probably have like prison cells going one way and the other. I just think it's an interesting comparison. And I'm not trying to say that the architects were trying to like make the kids feel like they're in a prison, but who knows, maybe it was just the kind of latent kind of tensions of the time that maybe made their way into the architects' minds and influenced this. Also, if the architects worked on the correctional facility, I mean, no, not the correctional, if they worked on central booking, I mean, who knows, maybe their work with prisons influenced this school as well. Also, these Y structures that I originally said can be seen as like lofty or kind of hopeful or progressive, could also be seen as a little bit imposing. I think this looks a little bit imposing, and I think the kind of shadowy glass windows just under the Y structure reminds me a little bit of like some sort of prison watchtower. It looks like someone could just be watching you from there. So yeah, also just in terms of the physical placement, unlike a lot of high schools, this Lake Clifton is extremely isolated from any like actual community. There's kind of like this moat of grass. And for that reason, I feel like it feels like a little bit of an island just kind of floating in the middle of the park with no like concrete connections to any type of neighborhood. This kind of makes sense because, I mean, it's on the site of what used to be a reservoir, which wouldn't have the same criteria for placement as a school. Also, as the school gained a reputation for violence in the later years, I would kind of hypothesize that, just to quote Jane Jacobs, I would say that there aren't many eyes on the street on this long walk to the bus stop, where there were quite a few incidents of violence, like kind of in the 80s and in the later years of the school. And there was one newspaper article that where they interviewed a kid who said, like, yeah, I always go out the back door because I don't want to interact with the crowds that kind of form on the walk to the bus stop. So I think I mean, obviously, like the architects didn't really have a say in where they put the school, but I still think this is interesting to think about just in terms of how it may have contributed to a sense of isolation or oppressiveness for the students and the teachers that work there. So to conclude, I would say that just to kind of culminate my like analysis of the school in terms of its historical context, I would say that the historical context in which Lake Clifton High School was built resulted in a fortified design, which was increasingly perceived as oppressive as early optimism wore off. So like as the desegregation plan failed and people began realizing that the school would not kind of meet all of its grand expectations that were set for it originally, I feel like this design that might originally be seen as very ambitious and kind of wild and technologically advanced might kind of flip to being seen as oppressive or even carceral. And of course, this is just my inference, and I would love to hear from people who actually went there, because the narrative is not complete without their input. I also think this brings up some interesting questions. Like, first of all, like, where does the blame lie for the failure of the school, or at least it's being perceived as oppressive? Is it likely that the architects were trying to somehow subdue the kids in there by making them feel like they were trapped in like a prison? Like, I doubt that, based on the optimism that kind of surrounded the school's early years, but who knows? That's just my take. Also, I wonder, does this sense of oppressiveness come purely from the design itself, or from a combination of design and unfulfilled expectations? So like a way I would look at this is like, on the very first day of school in 1971, when the building was like brand new, would any of the students read the building as oppressive, or would they read it as just state of the art and interesting and new? And of course, these are questions that I don't have the answers to, but I just think are interesting to think about. Also, another question I have is, would a more conservative and less ambitious design have helped the school to continue as a stable institution for longer? And I think I may actually have a bit of an answer to this, although I'm not sure if it's right. I would say that like, so as I mentioned, like the building was likely built to reflect the house plan, which was like this educational philosophy that was like thought out likely on paper, by like academics and researchers. And this very specific plan kind of required a lot to go right, and it required a lot of conditions. And one of those conditions is that the school, it's one of the most basic conditions is that the school is filled up and that there are enough kids so that this educational plan can like work out. And unfortunately, the huge capacity of the school was basically never fulfilled, which means that that's one of the most basic conditions for the school to work out as it was imagined. And I think that as enrollment decreased, and the school kind of split into smaller high schools that kind of just took up various bits of the campus. I think the design was not adaptable to change, and the people who designed it were assuming that current conditions would continue for forever, and they kind of took too much liberty, and they should have done something that was a little bit more immune to time and like change.
So I'm getting some messages from people who are saying that they're Lake alums, and just mentioning how it's a thoughtful presentation. Don't have any questions coming through yet. So while people are thinking about that, I'll start. So Juliet, you went to City College, which is taking on like a totally different sort of design, built in the 1920s and designed in this modern Gothic style, which sort of like resembles like a cathedral in England, or like a feudal holding in the UK. I was wondering like what your experiences with that design were like being a student there, and how that might have influenced your perception of that space.
Yeah, I think when I was at City, I didn't have as much awareness of like architecture at all. Like I knew it was like a privilege to like go to school in such a cool building, but otherwise like I didn't think too much about it. Like I did go on top of the tower a few times, which is really cool. But overall, I just wasn't very aware. Like I didn't even know it was collegiate Gothic or anything like that. Let's see. I guess one thing is that like if I was like standing in front of City, like I knew that City was like interesting or like cool, because it was so ornate. But if I was standing in front of Lake Clifton, I wouldn't have even thought to like look into the history of it. I wouldn't have even thought to think of it as historical at all, just because of the modernist design, just because I didn't know the role of like modernist architecture in the time of like the urban crisis. And even like I didn't even think of the 70s as like history, because like it kind of took a little bit more education for me to really be able to think about architecture from that time like critically. But yeah, City was cool.
And yeah, not seeing any questions. Everyone should be able to send questions to me. Okay, I'm getting something in here. Yeah, I guess we have Frank saying that he agrees with you that it's like this perfect storm of modernism in that time period, also with the sort of defensive outlook in cities and how that influenced the way that design was done. Um, and Susan here is saying that she's curious to hear from alums. Once I have met briefly, seemed proud entering it. When the Reach School was there, it seemed to me an exciting structure. So it's sort of interesting. And like you were saying about your experience at City, Juliet, it's, you're a student at school. And so you just think of it as school. And it's like that's like the place you are at this, maybe like the outside, the design influence are more subtle or subliminal.
Yeah.
Well, Nathan, we are at 12:45. We've done pretty well at sticking to our half an hour schedule. So if there are no other questions, I would say we say thank you again to everybody for hanging in there, and a special thank you to Julian, who almost in the beginning, it wasn't quite an apology for being young, but it should not be an apology for being a thorough researcher and certainly a strong intellect. And so we'll look forward to maybe having you back again and again over the years. Maybe someday you'll get to be old and gray like the rest of us, but no apologies for being young and thoughtful. Are we good, Nathan?
Yeah, we are. I did get someone asking about the artwork and if there's a plan for moving them when the school is torn down. And I know that that Ryan talked about that last month in his presentation. But Julian, do you have anything to add for that?
I would say Ryan is probably like the world authority on that, and I know that Ryan is working to be able to like preserve those artworks, but I know nothing more than that. And I would, I think you should contact Ryan or listen to his presentation because it's really good.
Yeah, I remember Ryan mentioning something about Morgan State was interested in figuring out what to do with some of those pieces. Okay, here's a counterpoint on brutalism. This will be the last thing that we mentioned before we close out from Shannon. He says it's best to understand brutalism in a broader context. These buildings were considered to be strong and robust, but those were attributes about permanence, not about controlling populations. In fact, many of the architects involved were purists about architecture and used architecture to reflect positive human aspirations. Figures like Paul Rudolph and the Smithsons were utopian, not dystopian in their outlook. It would be wrong to brandish them as control agents. So we're talking about the context in which they're designing.
Yeah, I definitely I didn't mean to like I really like brutalism, and I wasn't trying to like I was specifically trying to like say that I don't think that the architects were trying to be control agents. I think that's definitely like a narrative that is overplayed just because of the general negative public perception of brutalism. But I definitely would have talked about brutalism more if I was talking about like Southwestern maybe. I just didn't really recognize Lake Clifton as especially brutalist. Maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, I definitely appreciate brutalism as like a symbol of like utilitarianism and like civic pride. So yeah, thank you for your comment.
Yeah, and we do have a presentation on brutalism on our YouTube channel where we talk a little bit more about some of the nuances of brutalism and the way that design was being done. And I think one of the criticism that came out of it was during the period of the 1960s, there's more of this top-down approach to design. And today, what we're seeing now is more community input. So with the 21st Century Schools program, we're seeing architects and planners meeting with neighborhoods and families to get input about what they want to see. So there's more of this holistic approach to design that we're seeing in the 21st century.
Yeah.
I think that's it for today, and I hope everyone can tune in next week for a presentation on Baltimore's early Black architects. It should be a really good one with Dale Green. And thank you so much. And if you want to see a recording of this and any of our other virtual histories, if you search for Baltimore Architecture Foundation on YouTube, you should be able to find our channel. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you.